Who would have thought that the news would be asking if an Iranian missile could go nearly 4,000 kilometres towards Diego Garcia?
And who would have thought, when what seemed like a very arcane debate about a British base that seems like in the middle of nowhere, Diego Garcia, today is actually at the centre of the headlines in the latest developments in the war in Iran.
You have been talking to sources within the government, and you will reveal all in Saturday's newscast.
So let's tell you what we know. So we know at the moment that Iran, as part of its retaliation for the war that was being waged on it by Israel and the US, has attempted to fire missiles at Diego Garcia, which is a tiny island in the middle of nowhere that is the host to British and American military assets. Now, the missiles didn't make it. We know that the attack was in the last few days. The attack also was before the UK said late on Friday that it would allow America to use British bases to protect the Straits of Hormuz, which Keir Starmer's critics have seen as another step down the slippery slope in Trump's war. But crucially, that means that Iran had already tried to hit a British target many miles further than people might have thought Iran was capable of doing before Britain changed its position.
Yes, and that is a reminder that the plans put in place for years by Iran, if attacked, were to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz, and to take on bases in the region and threaten oil production. And now, it seems, threaten military assets belonging to the United Kingdom, used by the United States as well, thousands of kilometres away. So it represents a reminder that this is not Venezuela, President Trump. And President Trump has been schooled publicly, along with Benjamin Netanyahu, who wanted this to happen before Donald Trump even came to the White House, has been schooled in what years and years of defensive planning looks like from the regime in Iran.
And we should say that a bit later in the podcast, we'll be hearing from David Miliband, and we'll talk to him about the humanitarian impact on all of this, more than 1 million people on the move. But today, as we record at 1:10, and goodness knows what will have happened by the end of today, the focus of most of the headlines in the UK is on this attack on Diego Garcia.
And can I ask you, do you think it's important from the government's perspective to get that timeline information briefed?
It's incredibly important to the government to get this timeline briefed, which is, I think, exactly why I was told about the timeline this morning. So what happened yesterday was the UK said, sure, President Trump, who'd been calling NATO allies cowards and all sorts of things for not helping the US protect the Straits of Hormuz in a military way, the UK and others said, OK, you can use our bases to launch attacks on missile sites in Iran that have been chucking things at the Straits of Hormuz and clogging up the world's shipping with all the implications for the oil price. At the same time, Iran responded to that, essentially saying to the UK, you're playing with fire. There was a very strong Iranian response to that UK decision. So Downing Street does not want it to look like the attack on Diego Garcia was a direct response to the decision that they publicised yesterday. You've essentially got three things that happen here. Missiles try to fall on Diego Garcia, fired by Iran. They don't make it, but it's the first time we understand they've begun an attack that far away. Second of all, the UK, after that attack, says to the US, yes, you can use our bases for what to some people looks like an escalation in the war. Third thing, Iran responds and says, UK, that means that you are going to be a target for us too, and that is a mistake. So you can see why with those three steps, Downing Street does not want it to give the impression that the headlines today about Iranian missiles being flown at a British base are a direct result of a decision that the Prime Minister and his colleagues took yesterday to give the US permission.
Also, as we sat down, I was reading from the BBC's defence correspondent.
Yep.
There was chatter in the military expert circles about whether Iran does possess a missile that can travel that far. So people have been naming the individual missiles that they know Iran has, the ballistic missiles, and then questioning what we know about their technical specifications and if they could even reach, in which case you'd have to wait a bit to know more. But you could say that the targeting is a message in itself.
I think that's absolutely right. But it reminds me of what you've said every week in this short war you've said every weekend, this is about two things. It's about the map and it's about the clock. And this is about the map. Can they fire missiles that could actually be successfully targeted as far as 4,000 kilometres away? That has not been the assumption of the sort of defence establishment so far. Just to use the numbers, it was previously thought Iran's missiles had a range of about 2,000 kilometres. Diego Garcia is nearly 4,000 kilometres from Iran. So if it has secretly developed missiles that can go that far, the potentially frightening consequence of that is it means that Iran, in that scenario, would have the hypothetical ability to go for targets far beyond where this war is right now being conducted. Now, let's say, take a breath. As you've importantly told us, we don't know how close these missiles got. We don't know exactly what they were. Hopefully that will all become clearer in the next couple of days. But that's why this attempted attack on Diego Garcia has lit up the headlines this morning. It's not just because it was a British-US joint base. The Iranians have already been going after British assets since this war began. We know that already. We know at the beginning there was a strike that went into the side of a hangar, an RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. But the Diego Garcia attempted attack has lit up the headlines because it suggests that Iran might have better military capability than was previously thought.
A question for the youngest newscaster, which I think you can probably answer, is when was a man called David Miliband the UK Foreign Secretary?
He was the Foreign Secretary in the latter years of the New Labour administration. So I think from 2007 all the way up until the end of that period under Gordon Brown, 2010.
He is the brother, of course, of Ed Miliband, who's on the left of the Labour government and is also, of course, someone who wants us to get off our fossil fuel addiction.
Correct. His brother, David Miliband, is a little degree towards the right of the Labour Party. The job he's now doing is as boss of a very big organisation, the International Rescue Committee.
Yes, that's the name of it, the IRC. But also there's big news from the current Foreign Secretary.
That's right. So in order to try to find more money for defence, Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, is cutting £6 billion from the budget for overseas aid. That's the budget that does precisely the kind of thing that David Miliband organises and runs now. It gives money to aid agencies around the world. But what it also does, and this is one of the reasons why there's such pressure on that budget, it also goes towards paying for asylum seekers here in the UK. So there's been a controversy about whether that budget is being well spent. The original conception of overseas development under Tony Blair, the Department for International Development, was it was much better to pump money into conflict-torn or poverty-stricken countries around the world to tackle problems at source, to help people in need, and that would be a help for peace and stability around the world, rather than just putting a sticking plaster on in the form of eventually trying to help deal with the products of conflicts, if you like. But given the world we now live in, the government has again cut the aid budget. It gives us an interesting tension, therefore, between someone like David Miliband, who's a former colleague of Yvette Cooper, former Labour politician, but who's now dealing with the consequences of decisions that have been made by the people who are now in power here.
So there you have it. We have set out the reasons why you might want to listen, we hope you will, to David Miliband on Newscast, and here's our chat.
Hello, Paddy. Hello, Laura.
David, the war, which everyone is very anxious to see end, you, as Foreign Secretary, you had problems with a nuclear-armed Iran yourself. It's not as though Trump's wrong to say that the world's worried about a nuclear Iran.
Well, you're right that the Iranian nuclear issue is a long-standing one. We didn't have a problem with a nuclear Iran in the sense that it hadn't gone nuclear, and they always insisted that they never would. But you'll remember that we discovered a secret site of military development in Iran in the course of my tenure as Foreign Sec. And so the Iranian nuclear issue, the danger that Iran would become a nuclear weapons state, was certainly a very big issue. We were, I always said, 100% committed to the diplomatic, political track to resolve the nuclear issue. We didn't get there. It took another 5 years and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015 before a nuclear agreement was agreed. But of course, the American authorities in my time and before, they all looked at the military options. They all heard what the Iranians were saying about what they would do if there was any military action, and they steered away from it precisely because they thought, A, the military options were very unappealing, and B, the political track had some way to run.
Let's look at the second front, which is Lebanon. You have workers on the ground there, or you have programs on the ground there with the International Rescue Committee.
It's interesting you describe Lebanon as a second front. I mean, we certainly see with 1,000 people killed, 1 million or 1.2 million, I saw 1.2 million people displaced in a population of just 5.5 million. And you can see one in 4, 1 in 5 people in the country being forced to flee. We're facing a humanitarian emergency there. We have about 100 staff members working there, sadly reduced from over 200 because of aid cuts, because that's the other side of this equation. And we face a really striking situation. I would describe it as a humanitarian triple whammy. You've got, one, the direct impact of the war in places like Lebanon. Two, you've got the economic consequences for some of the poorest people in the world from the blockage in the Straits of Hormuz. 20% of the world's fertilizer goes through the Straits of Hormuz. And so that has a direct impact on global food supplies. The World Food Programme says that 45 million people are going to be pushed to catastrophic levels, emergency levels of food insecurity. And then thirdly, the third element of the triple whammy is obviously the geopolitics that splays out from this. We're very worried that in places like Ukraine, the war gets lengthened by this because of the stronger Russian position, but also wars in places like Sudan don't get the diplomatic and political bandwidth they need. So I think that Lebanon is the second front. It's not the only further front in this conflict.
And David, it's just extraordinary hearing you use those numbers there. And if people missed it earlier in the week, we spoke actually to President Zelensky about his conviction that the war in Ukraine is going to be harder to maintain and harder to push Russia back because of the war in Iran, not least because America is distracted. But I just wanted to emphasize the numbers that you gave us there. 1.2 million people just in one country, Lebanon, on the move because of this conflict. And then the further numbers who might be at risk of not having enough to eat because of the blockages in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, the last couple of weeks have been so frantic. People have been all watching, glued to their screen, and these sort of extraordinary pictures of gas facilities on fire and the White House pumping out these sort of meme-style videos of warfare mixed up with video games, even in that social media content. But what you're suggesting is we're not remotely yet understanding the true human cost of this war.
That's a really important. I'm relieved, frankly, that those numbers still have the capacity to shock, because the great danger is that the scale of humanitarian need around the world just gets normalized. I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an organization based here in New York, it calls the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, the effective closure, as a slow motion famine machine. And that's because you've got this constriction of fertilizer supplies, you've got the knock-on effects, and you've got the aid cuts that are taking place. And so thank you for retaining the ability to be shocked. We've warned of this triple whammy that's coming, and we've called on governments around the world to recognize it before it's too late.
Your former colleague in the Labour Party, Yvette Cooper, has said that there will be a diversion of British aid funds towards our defence budget. Are you sad about that?
Yes, I am. I mean, it leads to very difficult choices. Yesterday, the government, Yvette, announced, by the way, former colleague in the Labour Party. I used to be her colleague, I'm still her friend, and I'm still in the Labour Party. So the former applies to, I want to be clear about that.
No, this is the sort of detail that Laura gets very excited about. So, I mean, actually, you're making the right diversion here, because everyone can now go, oh, well, they were foreign secretary together when she was,
And they're not former friends,
anyway,
you're saying very, very carefully. So I can say, you are still friends. But yes, but you are clearly unhappy about the decision she's made, which is the point of substance here.
When the UK is spending 0.3% of national income on overseas aid, and about a quarter of that is spent in the UK for refugees or who've arrived in the last year, it's impossible to make the money go round in the way that it needs to. And that's how you end up with the very difficult choices. Now, I think it's important to say that Yvette's statement, she prioritized fragile and conflict states like Lebanon. She said 70% of UK money will go towards fragile and conflict states. That's a good thing. She prioritized, secondly, women and girls. They have multiple extra inequalities they face. It's very good that she's highlighted that. She said that there'd be no cuts in Sudan, which is the world's largest humanitarian emergency. But there's no denying it. When you have to cut, as they are, it ends up being very painful. Bilateral aid to Africa looks like it's going down very, very significantly. And my argument is that this is the time when there are very high levels and, in fact, rising levels of need around the world. It needs countries like Britain, but not only Britain, to stick with it. I'm very pleased the European Union is not cutting its aid budget. In fact, its proposals are to increase its aid budget because it's needed.
Is it a mistake then? And will Britain's decision, you say it'll mean difficult choices, but difficult choices in your line of work mean not enough food to go around?
Yeah, and the government's saying it's going to continue its support for the multilateral agencies like the World Food Programme, like Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines. That's very good. But I mean, Yvette herself said yesterday they didn't want to do it. They've been forced into it, and it will have consequences that are real for people around the world. Now, overall, just so you get a perspective on this, the total humanitarian budget, not just the British contribution, the total humanitarian budget in the last year has been halved. So 2 million clients of the International Rescue Committee no longer get services that they were getting at this time last year. That means a health center that we were running with US money in South Sudan for people who'd fled from Sudan is closed. So that has real consequences. There's no denying it. And it's important to say that the Iran war has its own consequences and these knock-on effects that I've described. There's a big story in the US now about this Straits of Hormuz and military action to open it. There's prior on this in the late 1980s in the Iran-Iraq war, when the US deployed there. They were able at that time to get 2 ships a day through the Straits of Hormuz, and there's dozens backed up. But here, there are 2 big differences that I think speak to the changing world we live in. One, the US was not a belligerent in the war in the 80s. It was the Iran-Iraq war. But secondly, and most significantly, the weaponry has changed since then. So this whole drone warfare that means you can send a drone for $40,000, it's changed warfare completely, and it makes it far, far more difficult.
I want to ask you about allies and about friends, because the strain on the Western alliance is growing. And as a former British Foreign Secretary living in the US, you're uniquely placed to address this. Without the USA, Donald Trump posted on his Truth Social, NATO is a paper tiger. They didn't want to join the fight to stop a nuclear-powered Iran. Now that fight is militarily won with very little danger for them. They complain about the high oil prices they're forced to pay, but don't want to help open the Strait of Hormuz, a simple military maneuver that is the single reason for the high oil prices. So easy for them to do with so little risk. Cowards, we will remember. What is the chapter that's turning in the Western alliance as this war unfolds?
Well, I think you're right to describe it as a chapter, because obviously it follows on the election of President Trump, where he was very clear that he wanted to lead a revolution in American foreign policy, and he wanted to change the way in which it commits to alliances. So that was, if you like, chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the whole Ukraine episode. There's then the Greenland chapter, which deserves a chapter all of its own. Now you've got this. I would say, though, Paddy, the US-UK relationship is a relationship between 2 countries, not just between 2 administrations. It's long-term, and it brings mutual benefit. I'd also point out, and I think this is really important, NATO is a defensive alliance. It springs into action when one NATO member is attacked. And of course, the most famous occasion when that's happened, in fact, the only occasion when that's happened, is on 9/11, when NATO rallied to the US side, and with all the consequences that we know. And so what I think that you're seeing there is that the campaign that the president has launched is called Epic Fury. That's the name of the military campaign. There's a lot of epic fury in Washington about the way in which this is going at the moment. But I would say that the relationship has strength that is institutional and that is country to country that's very important. And the president, to be fair to him, made clear that he wants NATO to be stronger, and that depends on the Europeans stepping up. which of course we
but
are.
those personal leader-to-leader relationships, though, matter too, whether that's for you as a former foreign secretary having relationships with your counterpart, or whether it's between American presidents and British prime ministers. How can leaders in other democracies cope with an American president who every day is sitting either in this sort of golden brocade chair in the Oval Office being rude about them, or seemingly late at night online calling them cowards, or, you know, joking about how Keir Starmer isn't Churchill with the actual bust of Churchill over his shoulder in the Oval Office? I mean, how are they meant to cope with that?
Well, I think that they have to focus on the substance, because it's the substance that in the end matters. There's absolutely no value in getting into a tweet competition about this. And you've got to focus on the substance of what you're doing. And that is the route to really being a valuable partner. It's the route to serving your own national interest and to preserving the NATO alliance, which remains very important. I mean, President Trump is right to say that NATO depends very, very significantly on the United States. And I would argue it's very strongly in America's interest to have NATO, but it's also very important that the European end of NATO, the so-called European pillar of NATO, is much stronger. I mean, we face the situation that the Russian threat is multidimensional. It's not just a Ukraine threat. And I always say every country in Europe has a Ukraine policy. No serious country in Europe yet has a Russia strategy. And that is what we need, because Russia is always going to be on the edge of Europe. And it's very, very important that we're able to recognize the diverse nature of the threats that it represents. For that, we've got to work much more closely together in Europe. It helps a lot to have the Americans there.
One of the big impacts on diplomacy has been the Mandelson affair and the Labour government run by Keir Starmer. And Keir Starmer's personal judgment in appointing him has been a big scandal here in the UK. Would you have advised him?
Really, Paddy? I haven't heard anything about that. I'm surprised to hear you say. This is all news to me. Honestly, I hadn't crossed my desk.
Well, let me ask you:
you'll have to fill me in.
If you had been asked, would you have said about your former Labour colleague Peter Mandelson, "Be careful if you appoint him"? And were you asked to give advice?
I wasn't asked to give advice. And so it's better not to deal in the hypotheticals, isn't it?
But what would you have said if we're going to appoint Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, to be the emissary to the White House?
I'm not going to get into it. I mean, all of us, I think, we saw Peter's skills, intelligence when we worked with him. I think everyone, certainly speaking for myself, I'm shocked by what's come out since then, or since over the last few months. And obviously it's been searing because there's long-term relationships that have all of us shaking our heads. But I don't want to say more because there's obviously investigations going on. It's not right for me to say more than that.
You were, though, also a candidate for that job. Several people have privately told me that you were being considered as the person who would have been an excellent ambassador. And your name was very much on the list, particularly if Kamala Harris had won and held the White House for the Democrats. Your name was perhaps even at the top of the list. Do you wish that you'd got that job? Would you have taken it?
I'm always say the same thing, as you know, Laura, boringly consistent in saying that I always want to do a job that best advances the things I believe in. And I always say I'm going to do that consistent with my obligations to my family. I'm absolutely committed to the UK. I think it's my country. I always want to do things to support the UK in any way that I can. But I'm not going to get into the one thing is people can describe you as a candidate for anything, and you just did. Fortunately, it's not the sort of thing where you put in a job application. It doesn't work like that.
But there were conversations,
as you know.
I do know that there's a sort of, it doesn't turn up on jobs.co.uk, but you would I think correct us if we were wrong to say there were conversations at very high levels about you taking that job.
Well, I think that the good thing about conversations at very high levels is that they stay on very high
Not always
level.
for very long.
I know you've got ears everywhere, Laura. You're too good. You're too good in all sorts of ways.
One of the British papers wrote that Keir Starmer surrendered to Ed Miliband, and that the kind of pro-climate side and the more leftist side of Labour is on the ascendant. But then Ed Miliband's facing the energy price shock. So is Ed Miliband in a stronger or weaker position than 6 months ago?
I mean, even if it hadn't been my brother, I wouldn't get into the semiotics of who. Look, it's a Labour government. It's not many Labour governments. They've got an enormously challenging set of tasks. They've got to go about it in a way that navigates the rapids of modern politics, which are very, very challenging. But it's not about. I'm definitely not going to go down the sort of the semiotics of the different strands of this. I think, to be fair to Keir Starmer, he's always been very committed to the very simple proposition that getting Britain off fossil fuels is a national security imperative, not just an environmental imperative. And so I don't think there's a division there.
David Miliband, great to have you with us on this weekend's newscast. Thanks so much and goodbye.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thanks very much, Paddy. Great to be with you.